Okay, well, it's my privilege and to introduce Ian Brown, who is a journalist, an author, and writer of several major books. He's a writer also of national magazine, newspaper, and has won several awards. You probably know him. He's well known to most of us, I think. Now, we can take this as a grain of salt. He tells me that he is one of the last feature writers at the Globe and Mail. I don't know. He will be telling us today about writing within journalism as he describes his challenges and hopefully its opportunities now and in the future. His talk today is, can long form narrative reporting survive the internet? Ian Brown.
Thank you, Doctor. I find it interesting that a journalist is introduced by a pediatric neurologist. Obviously, it's a subject of study. I'm also terrified, partly because it's a senior college, populated by ex-professors and librarians who actually know things, which never works out well for me. There are writers and thinkers I've admired for years. That even online, I think there are a couple of journalists who I've golfed with. That's not helping me in any way. And to make matters worse, I'm going to contradict some of the brilliant previous speakers we've had. And to make matters worse, I'm going to talk today about the future of something so old-fashioned and so out of date and so recherché that it actually probably belongs in a case in the ROM. I'm going to talk about good writing, and I'm going to talk about the future, and specifically the future of long-form feature journalism. That is, of long, well-written, compulsively readable nonfiction stories that aren't concerned with the news agenda in a technologized world where, thanks to smartphones and social media, and more recently AI, the average human being now has the intellectual attention span of a small, nervous Jack Russell Terrier. So right off the bat, I admit it is not going to be easy to make the case for long-form journalism, especially in an era when the expression TL:DR is all over the internet. That stands for too long didn't read. I consider that my personal enemy. The challenges journalism faces are manifold, as other speakers have pointed out. I won't dwell on them. Technology has undermined the business model. AI is trying, less successfully, I would say, to undermine journalism's authenticity. Authoritarians, Donald Trump, Pierre Poilievre, Russia, China, among them, are doing their best to undermine journalism's credibility, thereby discouraging people from getting involved, thereby discouraging them from voting and improving their own chances of getting their way. Meanwhile, the internet is throwing up 1,000,001 diversions. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah, a little louder? Louder and closer? Is that good? Okay, sorry about that. The internet's throwing up all these diversions and alternatives to reading long, well-written stories about the way we live now. The overall result is 30% fewer newsrooms today than there were 10 years ago, and smaller readerships for the ones that have survived. So we long ago said ta-ta to the collective, and I thought reassuring civic ritual of reading the newspaper together every morning. That doesn't happen anymore. And that's the general picture. A more specific complaint is that newspapers and journalism have become boring and less interesting. The number of people who tell me, who works at the Globe and Mail, that they've canceled their subscription. I can't, everybody I meet tells me this. And they say it's always because the journalism is boring. Why is journalism more boring? I think there is one main reason, because websites and newspapers and magazines, and some of you are old enough to actually remember magazines. They were great, They rely more and more on algorithms, on online measurements of what people are reading today to determine what newspapers and magazines will publish tomorrow. So they are making what I would call the fatal mistake, and this is going to offend some of the previous speakers, the fatal mistake of trying to tailor their stories to the audience, because technology allows them to do that. I think we should more or less ignore the audience. However, if a story about COVID or the Trump trial, or say Justin Trudeau's latest act of virtue signaling, it garners a lot of readers today. And at the Globe, we measure who is reading what and when they are reading it and where they are reading it and in what order they are reading it and for how long they are reading it. We measure all that very, very precisely. You can bet if that happens today, if those numbers show up today, that there will be more stories about COVID and Trump and Trudeau tomorrow. And with AI, algorithms will be able to aim that search for, and that new Trudeau story, not to mention ads, even more precisely at specific individuals. So, you will finally be getting the journalism you allegedly want, that the algorithm says you want, but I bet you won't find it very satisfying for a number of reasons that I hope to get in before my 20 minutes are up. The result of algorithmic editing, even more than was the case pre-internet, is that every media outlet now covers the same stories. The Pew Institute in the United States measures what is aptly known as the news hole. What does that sound like? Precisely. Everything that is published or aired in print or online or on the airwaves every 2 weeks. And the statistics always reveal exactly the same pattern. 3 or 4, maybe 4, usually it's 3 stories, represent 95% of the content in the news hole, repeated again and again and again in the hope of gathering more online hits. You think about that. If 95% of everything that is published relates to only a tiny fraction of what happens in the world, the vast majority of human experience never gets written about. And we are allegedly in the middle of a communications revolution. I mean, that's good news for writers, because it means we have more to write about. But it also explains why more and more people are moving away from reading newspapers, and in fact, in some cases, from reading in general. I personally hope that there's something good in this trend. Competition from a new form of media has threatened to overwhelm the written word and writers many times in the past. It happened in the 1920s and 30s when radio was the threat. The result was magazines like the New Yorker, Vanity Fair, Esquire, a whole new generation of better, deeper, better written, longer form magazines. It happened again in the 1960s when television threatened those magazines, and the result was new journalism, an entire new form of brilliant long-form fiction. I'm not a futurist. I am an optimist. I hope we are headed into another period when journalists will forget about covering things fast, because, the new girl in town, the internet, and all her freakish cousins, they can do that faster. And I hope we will be more concerned instead with how originally we choose our stories and how well we tell them, without regard to trying to make money off the people who are reading them. Because the only way a journalist or an original story can stand out in today's inferno of information is by writing superbly, by the quality of the storytelling. If you cannot tell a story well today, you are lost. You should get out of the business. So I'd like, if we could, just to remind ourselves of what the purpose of great long form journalism is. Ernest Hemingway, who was also a great journalist, as well as a great novelist and short story writer, hideous guy apparently, but great writer. Well, yes, he was cute as well. That's right. He had that going for him. Now I see what the standards of the senior club are. Ernest Hemingway once said that a writer's first job is to figure out and describe what is actually true, as opposed to what is supposed to be true, or what seems to be true, or what other people want to believe is true, or want you to believe is true, or even what you yourself would like to believe is true, to conform to your own prejudices. We all have those prejudices, but good long form writers try to work past those. The second job, Hemingway said, is to describe all of that in a way that moves the reader using just words on the page so that they remember what they've read. Whenever I'm asked to talk to journalism students, which can be a depressing experience, I find, given how little they care about writing. Seriously, I know, I said I irritate people. Whenever I am asked to talk to journalism students, and it's only sometimes a depressing experience, about how one does that, how one figures out what's actually true and then puts it in a form that comes off the page, I tell them there are essentially two kinds of information. The first kind of information is the information you need to know that helps you live your life. Whether it's going to rain, whether the Americans are going to reelect a sociopath, whether the lamb is on sale at Loblaws, the news, basically. The other kind of information, which is the information long form writers deal in, is the information you didn't know you wanted to know, but are thrilled to discover. That's the kind of information that makes your life worth living. Adam Phillips, the English writer and psychoanalyst, makes a distinction in his book, Attention Seeking, between our official curiosity and our unofficial curiosity. Our official curiosity is a form of obedience, an indebtedness to the authorities. That would be the news. In our unofficial curiosity, he goes on, we don't know who we want to be judged by. It's the difference between knowing what you are doing and following our eyes. So that would be the second kind of information. To survive, I think, print or written journalism needs to concentrate on the second kind of information, to be more disobedient to the official news agenda, whatever it is, and it's a varied thing, and its compulsions, and to do that in a more stylish way, employing writing that, and this is a thing that never gets discussed anymore, writing that gives readers actual pleasure. And I am talking about physical pleasure. I'm talking about writing that comes up and rubs itself against you and makes you want to engage. The first time I ever encountered this second kind of factual information, the information I didn't know I wanted to know, I was a teenager. It was in a John McPhee book called Oranges. It is a quiet but flawlessly constructed piece of writing. Early in the book, McPhee describes the 17th century court of the King of Spain, who gives a visiting prince an orange as a gift, because back then the King of Spain was the only guy who had any oranges. And that orange, incidentally, is the origin of the tradition of putting an orange in a Christmas stocking, which, because you're all professors and librarians, you already know. A few pages after that, the reporter's in Miami, visiting a frozen orange juice factory, which is controlled by the mob. And about 200 very compelling pages after that, I put the book down, astonished that I had actually read an entire book about a subject I didn't realize I was at all interested in. But I never eat an orange today without feeling a little bit of gratitude for that book. And I still hold that as my ideal, which is to get you to read all the way to the end of 3,500 words about, say, a disabled child, a subject that some of you may never have wanted to read about. So what I'm trying to say is that we're drowning in the first kind of information, the stuff you're supposed to know, the information you have to be obedient to. But most of us are actually pining for the second kind of information, the surprising stuff that reveals parts of ourselves we never knew were there. Writers who traffic in the first kind of information tend to know what they think generally before they start to write. And writers who traffic in the second kind of information only know what they think when they finish writing. And the second kind of writer's journey of discovery is then conveyed to the grateful reader, which is why we need to restore that pleasure of discovery to the experience of journalism, which otherwise just feels like, constantly eating and never being satisfied. And I think that's why podcasts and maybe even TikTok, as one of our earlier speakers mentioned, are so popular these days, though, many podcasts are also going broke these days, because they are conversations, and conversation is a kind of royal road to the unexpected, to the unpredictable, to not more of the same, to what we didn't know we wanted to know. And to create that kind of fetching, unpredictable journalism, we have to pay much less attention to algorithms, because nothing great ever got written as the result of a reader survey. And what is the internet and social media for the most part, and the measurement of what the audience reads, except a very elaborate reader survey? With the newspaper where I work, the Globe and Mail, it's a daily. Some of you used to read it. The content of the daily newspaper, the news, the first kind of information, is determined by a number of factors, by events, by what other outlets are writing about, by what seems to be working online, and sometimes by what the reporters have uncovered. But I cannot remember when we last had a features meeting. I think we have two feature writers. I know I'm a feature writer, and I think Jana Pruden in Edmonton would probably qualify. We don't have meetings. I'm lucky enough to work with a single editor with whom I have many conversations, sometimes over wine or beer, to find out what grabs our hackle of curiosity. When something does grab that hackle of curiosity, for reasons I don't understand, I set out to find out why it has interested me, and that sometimes becomes a story. So in the past year, my hackle of curiosity, if you don't mind my calling it that, I'm not trying to be rude, has been grabbed by the bond market, which is a weird and interesting and fascinating place that hardly anybody understands, by AI and the people who create deepfakes, who are extremely weird people, the sport of rowing, which seems Sisyphean to me, but is oddly captivating. By the end of winter as a season because of climate change, I think that's well on its way. And by Joe Biden's age and whether or not it ought to be a consideration in the election. And I came to the conclusion after studying the evidence that it has absolutely no relevance to what's going on, given the job he's doing. I'm currently thinking of going back to university for a few weeks as a student to see what it's like to be a student nowadays. Everything I read says that it's, everybody's pushing you around and telling you what to do and you're not allowed to talk. I'd like to experience that firsthand if I possibly could. So I think I might end up doing that as a story. The point is, none of these stories came from an algorithm or from a study of the market or from a study of the audience. They came from passing details that caught my interest and that were sustained. That, I think, is the heart of journalism. Everything else is make work programs to hire people who aren't journalists. Excuse me. In the old days, before algorithms and what was happening on the internet, which is another way of saying the market, started to dictate what we wrote about, feature meetings at the Globe were held every 3 months or so. And everyone in the newsroom came in and sat in the big room and pitched 2 stories. at one of those meetings, this is a side story. One of those meetings, a young reporter, Colin Freeze, he was young then anyway, jumped up and said he wanted to write about gay porn. And I had just finished reading a book about voyages around the tip of South America. And I said quite loudly, "Oh, I love gay porn." I can't get enough of it. And Colin looked at me and he said, "You really don't seem like the type." And and that was when I realized I needed to get hearing aids. In any event, the stories that got attention in those meetings, and they were fun. They were really fun. I'm constantly saying at the Globe, we should bring them back. Everybody would enjoy them, but we publish so few. We pay so little attention to good writing anymore that we don't really need the meetings, I guess. In any event, the stories that got attention, that got published, were the ones that made the room listen and react and laugh and talk. In other words, the stories that appealed to us instinctively as readers. And of course, it's impossible to measure instinct. So, that never gets counted in an algorithm. The tech companies like Google and Apple pretend otherwise. But most of the time, with very few exceptions, most of us don't know what we're interested in. This is really the motto of journalism. We want to be led to water, and not just by an algorithm that is statistically matching what we've read or watched or listened to with what someone else has read and watched and listened to, which is how all those, if you like this, you'll really like this, actually work. They're meaningless. I admit the Trump trial, I've been watching that. I cherish every moment of embarrassment. The Masters golf tournament, I did watch the last day of that for a couple of hours. On the other hand, I didn't know I was interested in the popularity of sadomasochism amongst teenagers, specifically strangulation during the act of sex, until I came upon that story last weekend in the New York Times. And I doubt a reader survey could have isolated that interest. That came from the writer. Unfortunately, my interest didn't last long because the story was not very well told. And that is the real problem for newspapers and websites like the Globe and Mail, as well as for journalists. Good nonfiction storytelling is very, very, very hard to do. It requires time and money because it requires actually twice as much reporting as a news story. The long form writer, if she's good at what she does, gathers up the who and the what and the where and the when and the why, which is what news reporters do. But she then has to do a whole other layer of reporting to be able to use the four main techniques of all great narrative writing and storytelling, to get enough information that she can tell the story in scenes, which is action united by time and space, to record and transcribe dialogue, because dialogue is essential to a readable story, to record endless details of status and appearance and manner, which help to put the reader in the scene, and finally to gather the various points of view of all the people, or as many of the people as you want, who are involved in the story. Without scenes and details and dialogue and point of view, you cannot write a long story that is compulsively readable. You can't write a story that will move the reader, because the only way to make a reader feel something using only words on the page is to use those four techniques. If our feature writer doesn't use those techniques, she won't write a story that readers will read and remember, which is what will make them loyal to her writing and to her publication. I admit that some of this can get you in pretty hot water. How am I doing for time? I have to finish? Okay. All right. Well, you're missing a great story. I'm just telling you. In my 40 years of being a journalist, I have never encountered a time when less attention is paid than is paid today to the quality of writing and storytelling in journalism. I mean, yes, we have data journalism now that scrapes the internet for statistical insight into the way we live, and it is brilliant. But I mean, tell me honestly, Do you want to read it? I don't think so. You ought to want to read it, but they pay too much attention to the scraping and nowhere near enough attention to the story. At the Globe, we have rank upon rank of audience specialists. There are almost more of them than there are the reporters. I'm not entirely sure what they do, but I do know that a year or so ago, I wrote a story about a widow in Goderich who was building a deck on her property, and she unearthed a human skull. And that turned her yard into an archaeological dig for a year and a half and cost her $70,000 because that's the law in Ontario if you find bones on your property. And I followed her for about 6 months until the bureaucrats finally let her bury the fragments in a graveyard. And she had to buy the plot, by the way. And that story attracted a huge number of readers. And a couple of days later, I went into work and I was asked to address the Globe's online readership specialists. How did I know, they asked, that that was a good story? Because the algorithm had not predicted its success. And I said, it's a story about a woman who finds a skull buried in her backyard. What's not to like about that? The internet, and my point being that the internet and especially social media are very adept at telling us what we're supposed to be interested in and what's supposed to be true. They are much less adept at revealing what is actually interesting or true. And the irony of journalism's abandonment of narrative nonfiction and skillful storytelling is the irony is that it's the only kind of journalism that actually gets remembered historically. Defoe's Journal of a Plague Year, narrative nonfiction, Hemingway's Death in the Afternoon, Orwell's Down and Out in Paris and London, Hersey's reporting on Hiroshima, Michael Hare, dispatches from Vietnam, John Valiant stories about the Golden Spruce and about firefighters. All of that is long form narrative nonfiction. Written, I might add, and edited and rewritten to a T. And all of that journalism grew out of the same root, out of an individual writer's curiosity and literary skill, out of a good editor and out of a daring publisher. There is nary an algorithm, to be seen. Writing counts most of all in nonfiction. What you choose to write about counts. So what I am trying to say, I think in the end, for all the frou-frou discussing the future of the media and its great importance, what I'm trying to say is that the antidote to the sinister forces that seem to want to undermine good journalism and cripple a free press and cripple democracy, the antidote is the same as it ever was. Good, old-fashioned, eyewitness, shoe leather reporting and skilled, energetic, disobedient, thank you very much, storytelling. We have to find a way to afford and pay for more of that. That is the kind of writing, I think, that can save journalism, as has always been the case. Without it, without returning to stories for the sake of stories, rather than to achieve some corporate goal or some profit or some segment of readership, without returning to stories for their own sake, we'll lose you, the readers, and we will deserve to have done so. Thank you.